like I said, for this edition of Author Talk. Today we have Dr. Volker Nolte, who is a professor emeritus at the University of Western Ontario, where he taught biomechanics and coaching, and was also the head rowing coach for the men's team. He's rowing coach from 1993 to 2017. Under his direction there, the team won 14 Ontario University Athletics Championships and 6 Canadian University Rowing Championships. Since 2019, as the women's rowing coach, the team has won 5 Ontario University Athletics Championships, in addition to a host of other accomplishments. He was also the German Rowing Association's coach and helped lead them to the silver medal in the 1996 Olympics in Atlanta. It seems like his list of accomplishments are endless. We could probably go on and on talking about those. But today he is here with us to talk about some of those experiences. And also his book, Rowing Science, The Nexus of Knowledge and Performance. So again, thank you so much for taking a little bit of your time today to talk to us about this. I really do appreciate it.
Yeah, well, thank you for this nice invitation there. And I'm happy, obviously, to talk about this book, where I'm very proud of. Right? And I mean, also, this would have not possible without the help from Human Kinetics. I really enjoyed it with the working relationship with your company there. It's fantastic.
And we'll talk about some of those previous experiences too. I gave the listeners a brief bio, I guess, and some of your background, but for a little more context, just because I want to know everyone where you're coming from on this topic. Could you give everyone an idea of like kind of how you got into rowing and kind of your journey to how you got to where you are today?
Well, I mean, this also is a long story. I mean, it's long ago. I was actually, I tell the story, I was about 13 years old when I, by chance, rode my bike close to the river in my hometown. And it happened to be that a rower in a single stopped right in front of me and turned around and moved away to the other direction. And I don't know if you are aware of a rowing boat. A single is about 8 meters long. So what is this, 24 feet long? But then it turns around, and when you look straight at it, it's just 1 foot wide. Right. And then it turns around and it becomes 24 feet again. Okay. So I was very intrigued by the technology and by the movement of the rower. So I got interested. I rode home with my bike and said here, my parents, I want to go rowing. I need to be able to row or manage such equipment. So this is how it started. And then I was very, very lucky, I believe. I went through literally all the steps. I learned rowing. I started my first regattas. I became German junior champion. I rowed at the Junior World Championships and got into active rowing. I almost made it to the Olympics, not quite as a rower. Okay. And I experienced actually very poor coaching, especially on the national level. Okay. And so this is when I got interested and say, I want to do something about this. And I started studying sport, became a coach educator very early in my career there, and I learned that it's important to produce some information about the sport. So I started publishing, and it became really a passion. And rowing is literally took over in my whole life, right? Right. I got talked into coaching by 2 young German athletes who I met again by chance. On the water, I rowed with them, and they said, well, you know so much, why don't you coach us? So I started coaching, was successful with them, several world championship medals. And I then was also hired by the German Rowing Association as a national team coach. Eventually, I met my wife at a rowing regatta, although she is not a rower. That's, again, it's a longer story, and she's obviously Canadian, and she brought me to Canada. Okay. And I got invited here in Canada by the national team coach, El Moro, to come, and this was my contact there. They said, oh, well, you're doing okay. So they gave me some responsibilities with the Rowing Association. Western University became interested in me. I became a faculty professor, and this was actually a huge turning point in my life, because this was a position that was literally made for me. I was half a rowing coach and half a professor.
Okay.
So I could coach, I could work with a big rowing team, could develop the rowing team, and on the same side I could do research, I could present at classes, I was invited at coaching conferences, I published. So I would say it's a complete rowing package. It's literally not possible to do more in rowing. If you wish.
No, it really sounds like you've covered just about every area possible of rowing in your life in one respect or another. I mean, you were an athlete, you got into coaching. It sounds like out of need. You obviously got into the education side of it. And speaking of that, it sounds like you were just so eager to help other people be more successful at rowing. And that kind of led to the 2 editions of Rowing Faster that you've done, that you've edited. Now, I know this book is similar, but even at first glance, it looks like this one goes a little more in depth than the previous 2 editions. So what are some of those biggest differences that you guys have made in this edition?
I mean, it's at first, it was a really a nice coincidence that I got the chance to publish the Rowing Faster. And so the first edition was also held by an employee of Human Kinetics, who is now part of the new book, Ed McNeely. He worked at the time as an editor with Human Kinetics, and we had the first book. And you probably noticed from your own experience, whenever you put something on paper and you publish something, immediately you know what you can do better.
Yep.
Right? It's this funny situation. It's not an end of all means, right? It's almost like it opens up new ideas. So the first book was very much a practical book with all kind of rowing topics. Specifically with contributors were international rowing coaches. You know, there were national team coaches from England, from Canada, from New Zealand. They were involved in this, and then when it came about the second edition, we expanded a little bit. We brought actually world-class athletes, Olympic champions, to write the introductions to all the different topics. So we got some view from athletes included, and the last book here that I published, the Rowing Science, was actually it started with I went to Human Kinetics and said, you know, I'm getting older and I did a lot in my life. I would like to do one, almost like compile everything that I know about biomechanics, to put it together. And I said, well, biomechanics, rowing is not such a big topic. If you want to do something in science, we actually have a series. You know, you have the science of bicycling, running, swimming, and so on. Right. So it would fit really well in our series. And I said, oh, this sounds really, really interesting. And so the Rowing Science is now a compilation of rowing topics from I would say almost completely a scientific point of view. However, all the contributors are people who work or worked with national teams. Okay. So researchers, in their mind, they publish worldwide. And then there are also very experienced with working with top class athletes. So it is, so to speak, almost like a logical continuation, and now also expanding, more scientific based, and it's obviously also almost twice as big, right? Therefore, way more in depth. And then also there are some topics that are never ever published in any rowing technical book, right? About, for example, the boat construction. you know, Clint Burston and Dan Béchard. You don't find anything like this in any of the books, as an example.
Okay. One thing we touched on there was the contributors. I know that I noticed, if I counted correctly, there were 12 contributors to Rowing Science, the specific edition. What was that process like in getting everyone together, and how did you really decide who was going to be involved and what? Certainly, they had their own areas of expertise that helped them, you know, kind of guide them through each specific section that they did. But how did that whole process kind of go down?
I mean, in a certain way, it was a two-step process. Okay. Number one was, as I said, from the experience from the Rowing Faster books, I really wanted to include top class, I mean, the top class researcher in rowing science from the different fields.
Right.
And so I was thinking about this, and I was very, very lucky that I had a chance as a rowing coach, as a coach educator, to get around the world and meet these people. So, for example, Brett Smith, I met when he was involved with the New Zealand national team, and he was involved at a time when New Zealand really became from a, let's say, a small country to one of the top, if not the top country in the world. And so I had the idea about and the knowledge about some of the top rowing experts in the world. Jane Thornton, for example, she is top in the world in terms of rowing injuries. She is on the IOC committee for injury prevention and such things. Penny Wertner worked with the Canadian team and so on. Okay. So I got at first a number of contacts, and I spoke to them and said, "Are you interested?" They were very interested, and we started to get together and develop the program for the book. And then the pandemic hit. Some of the contributors that we had lined up excused themselves because of the situation. Their professional situation changed. Some of them struggled to maintain their job. You know, they were working with national teams, they're working with universities, and everything's changed and so on. Right. So we lost some of the contributors. And then it took some time until we reconciled what we can do. And then the human kinetics Anne came on board and said, you know, what can we do? We need a few more people there that couldn't help us anymore. So she helped with, for example, to get Steve Chung involved, who is an expert in the physiology and environment, right? We talked about Ed McNeely, who helped. So there were a two-step concept. The one started by the people that I knew that I really wanted to get involved. And then we really said, who can we really fill in on this level of expertise? And we found excellent people there to help us.
Okay, great. Now, you mentioned that this really is a compilation of just about every aspect you could possibly think of, it seems like. And for everyone that has their copy, if you haven't got your copy yet, I mean, this book goes through rowing mechanics, like you mentioned, physiology of rowing, different components of rowing that are important as far as, you know, resistance training and cross training. There's sports medicine, nutrition, psychology. How important was it for you, or maybe with all of your knowledge, how gratifying was that to be able to include all of those different sections to really give everyone just about every bit of knowledge that they could possibly ask for?
Well, I mean, as I said, it was a process that we specifically worked with Anne Hall from Human Kinetics to make it a really a complete package. And it was obviously a help that we had the idea from the other science books, the swimming and the bicycling. So we had already some templates. But we knew that certain sections were important. And then, of course, as I said, through the experience over the long years working on the other books, and I mean, also when I work as a coach educator, people ask me about, for example, the boat technology and such things. So I said these things have to come in, and I had to find top experts in this area, for example, and this is Glenn Burston and Dan Béchard from a world-class boat building company who, so to speak, tell their secrets about boat building in this book.
Yeah. Now, I do want to get into a little bit more of the content that's in the book. And I know right off the bat in chapter 1, it's mentioned that a lot of times with these types of athletes, genetics can play a role in how successful you might be. Now, I know this probably goes into the biomechanics of rowing, but how important is anthropometry in a sport like rowing, in just like different proportions and different body types?
I mean, I would say genetics is, of course, really important, that an athlete brings the basics of physiology and power application to the sport. Okay. However, there is still a lot to learn in this area. I mean, if you do statistics, you will find that tall people with long arm span, wherever, you find them predominantly in rowing. But then once in a while, you find also these super athletes who are very driven, extremely physiologically talented, right? Which much smaller athletes who can balance this off. So it is, of course, let's say, a help when you are taller in rowing, but it is not a 100% must. You know what I mean? Okay. So there is actually, and Paula Jardine is actually a super expert in this area. She worked as a talent identification officer in Canada and in England, and she has lots of experience in this area. And there is obviously this interest to channel the investment into athletes, and say, okay, how can we make sure we invest in the proper athletes? And then say, okay, let's try to find these tall people. Well, these tall people are often also the early developers, right? And rowing specifically is a sport where latecomers have a huge success. Swimmers, triathletes, and so on, who for whatever reason, let's say injury problems and such things, can come to rowing a little bit later, right? And then are very successful. However, again, they bring all the attributes that you need in rowing. You know, it makes it a better rower, or you have a little bit better chance if you're tall, right? You have to have a huge motor to power along for whatever this 6 to 8 minutes at full blast. Right, and you have to have the spirit, the mind for the psychology to withstand training for a longer time, because it also has shown that you cannot expect that someone all of a sudden comes into rowing and then immediately becomes world champion, right? I mean, as an example that is now often used, and you may have even heard about this, Oliver Seidler from Germany. He was a top swimmer, right? He's a 2'4" athlete, so a huge man, right? Got into rowing and learned it relatively quickly, but he is still, and he is now in the sport, I think 6 or 7 years. He is already twice a world champion, but for example, at the Olympic Games, he underperformed, right? So he even from his perspective, with his abilities and his athletic background, he still needs time to do this to really get proficient in the sport. And I think this is in most of the sports.
Right. That's really interesting. I'm glad you mentioned that. I have seen, so I'm in the Midwest United States, and we do not have, rowing teams like in high school or in school situations like that. But I have seen situations where, like you said, there might be a swimmer or maybe a volleyball player, a taller athlete with longer limbs. I've seen a few specific cases where they actually get recruited to be on a rowing team in college. And for the longest time, I wasn't sure why that was, like how these coaches at the collegiate level were able to identify these specific athletes. So I think you kind of answered my question right there. So do you think that's becoming more common, or maybe it's common in areas where athletes might not grow up with rowing as a sport, but then they get into it later on in life?
I mean, I would say the majority of the athletes in college, for example, or then later on in the national team, are athletes who learned rowing either in a club or in a high school situation. Okay. However, it is quite successful recruiting athletes from other sports who, for example, swimmers, when they get too big or whatever, they are not so good with the way they lie in the water anymore, or volleyball players, they get injured because they cannot jump anymore, whatever. Right? As long as they have the athletic abilities and the mindset. So, I will give you a little story where you just said volleyball players. I tried to recruit volleyball players here from the University of Western Ontario. And I mean, there are obviously walk-ons to the volleyball team, and they do their selection and so on. As I said to the volleyball coach, if you give me a chance to talk to the athletes that you will reject, right? And let me talk to them and invite them to our what we call novice or learn to row program. So I spoke to them, and none of them that I did there were interested. The very simple reason, it's a different mindset, right? Okay. In volleyball, it's the ball, it's the playing, it's the fun, blah blah, right? In rowing, at first, it's a grind, right? And when they heard, for example, well, when are you training? I said, well, 5:30 in the morning. I said, oh yeah. That's when I have my deepest sleep. So what I'm saying with this, if you find an athlete, a volleyball player or a swimmer, who has the mindset and, of course, the physiology to have that you need in rowing, these guys are relatively easy to confirm, and they get relatively quickly successful. Right? But this is a very small number. So if you find the person, you have a high probability to transform into rower. Right? You have to find them with the right mindset. So this is probably what it comes from. So, and I believe coaches always try to fill their team up with good prospects. So I would think that coaches are looking for a specific type of athletes. So tall people with athletic background and the proper mindset. And you can be very successful in transforming them into rowing. Okay.
It sounds like one of the differences that you've mentioned is that mental aspect of rowing. And I know there, like I said, there is a section in the book specifically on psychology of rowing. How, from your experiences and from your knowledge base, how does that differ from some other sports that people might be familiar with? And what is that difference like in maybe even in trying to convert athletes of other sports into rowing?
I mean, I think every sport has their specific psychological demands. So, for example, let's say if I compare a rower with a high jumper, right? A high jumper, they do whatever, and I'm talking about specific training, means when they jump and in rowing when they row, right? A high jumper, they will jump and then they sit around for 5 or 10 minutes to recover, look up the video, what they can do better, and they work on these little fine, minute details, and they do this for, let's say, quite some time, and they are tired afterwards. They didn't work physically the same way like rowers. So in rower, you sit in a boat, right, and you go and row quite intensively for 1 hour, and this is quite a different kind of work. So the psychology of the high jumper is that these people can dissect their movement to the smallest amount and say, okay, I have to put the foot just a little bit differently, or I have to go a little bit more in a bent knee and so on. So very small little details.
Okay.
Where the rower has to have the philosophy or the psychology, sorry, to really be consistent, work hard. Even if you get tired, right? When you slip a little bit with your focus to come back. So every sport, in a soccer player, you need to know all the different games. You have to have a big a view of the field and so on. So every sport has their specific psychological demands. And this is what we try to capture, obviously, with Penny Wertner, who has a lot of experience in this area, right? And presented in the book.
Okay. Now I know an area of interest specifically for you is the biomechanics of rowing. So I'll give you a little opportunity to talk about that. What all goes into specifically the biomechanics? I mean, we can just put it simply there in being successful or being as successful as one can in a sport like rowing.
Well, I mean, it's I put this together in the biomechanical principles that I discovered over the many years that I'm in this area. And I mean, I take only one area out that fits a little bit together with what we just talked about, the size of a person, is you need to be able to have a long stroke. Okay. So if you are able to place the blades in the water very far, so to speak, and have a long time the blades in the water to accelerate the whole system, right? So the long stroke is very important, and specifically you need a long catch. So the first starting point when the blades go in the water is called the catch, right? So you need a large catch angle. So from a biomechanical point of view, is one of my pet subjects is to really support the long catch position. People are still wondering, is this correct? Are you getting the proper efficient force directions there and so on? And I should show this many times. Yes, you can. So the point there is I can show that it is highly effective or efficient to place the blades far in the water, right? But now the point is, how do you teach this to an athlete? How you make the athlete to feel it properly? Because you only then, when you place the plates, you have to obviously do this with the right amount of speed. If you push too hard, you go into like what we call concrete situation, right? It becomes very heavy. If you're not doing it fast enough, you're losing the area where it's really efficient. Okay. So these are areas that I try to explain, but obviously every coach has to understand it on their level. Also then to have to teach this to athletes different, right? Sometimes it's good to show pictures, sometimes to let them feel it and experience it so they get the tactile feedback and so on. So there are different ways of doing this. So my point there is I can present these principles, and they are now proven over many years from all other researchers too. Now the trick is then to translate it into your training technique, in your way of teaching is to the athletes. That's a little bit the tricky part, right? And I try to mention this also in the book by talking about the technique and the different styles. But again, this is a much wider area offering. However, the basics of the biomechanics, all this is what I researched over the years, is presented there. Okay. But this was one of the principles. So we could obviously talk more.
Right. Yeah, we could probably talk all day about that. What is, I want to ask this question. I know that you have pretty much grown up with rowing and grown up in the sport. For people not involved directly in rowing, what do you think one of the biggest misconceptions might be of the sport, or of maybe it's the preparation of the athletes, or what goes into being successful?
I mean, there are still a number of myths out there from a biomechanical point of view. So, for example, just what we talked about, if you go with a very wide catch, people say, you know, you pinch the boat. That's one thing, for example. The other area in rowing tactics, there is in rowing still this belief that constant pacing would be more efficient, right? There are obviously in training physiology belief to long distance training versus high intensity training and so on. So there are still some discussions in this area too. There is the point is you have to find the exact training, the technique, the psychology of the individual athlete. If you go on the really high level, you have to start on the basics to do the basic things right? Do basic endurance, row with the proper technique, rig the boat properly, set the proper development, the psychology that you're not burning people out too early, because rowing is obviously a very work-intensive sport, right? So this is the basics. But then when it comes to the top athletes, to identify the area, how to teach, how to implement the newest research into their training. And the interesting point there is also very often top athletes and top coaches, they push the limits and make the researchers think about things. For example, long distance training, right? There is still considerable discussion about what is the proper intensity, the proper durations, and so on, right? And there are obviously a lot of research done and also presented here. Brett Smith and Gunnar Treff are enormously experienced in this area. But there are still some areas where I say, well, we can tweak a little bit more. And some of the rowing nations show this, for example, right? So the basics are, in a certain way, very clear, but then you have to take the knowledge and pinpoint it in the very, very right direction.
Okay, very good. Another question I want to bring up. This is more of like maybe an interesting question, entertaining question. From your experience, you definitely had a lot of experience in the sport, in the field. What is one of your best memories to date, to this point, that you've had, whether that was as an athlete, as a coach, certainly very accomplished there. What is one of the biggest accomplishments or best memories that you have so far?
I mean, this is I've been asked this question quite frequently, right? And I mean, the point there is, I feel I'm an extremely lucky person that I had the chances to experience the sport of rowing from different aspects, as an athlete, as a coach, as a researcher, as a coach educator, and so on. So there are obviously special moments where I said they were fantastic. I mean, for example, I remember in 1993, I was waiting at the finish tower at the World Championships in the Czech Republic, and I saw the aide that I was coaching coming towards me. And to me, from my eye, they rowed better than ever. It was the day they put everything together, and I was 1,000 meters away, impossible to see who was leading. I was 100% sure they would do well.
Right.
And when they came and they won, and this was such a satisfying experience, because I could see that the boys really put everything together. This is one example. Right. I mean, I was then lucky, for example, to coach an aide at English Henley, which is probably the most famous rowing regatta in the world, right? And we had to race over 6 days. There are these dual races, and the winner goes on, and the loser has to leave the regatta, right? And then every day to see how the crew developed and how the bond got stronger. They got obviously also more tired, and then they had to go out and race again. and how they prevailed in this situation over such a long time. For example, the excitement of parents. You know, what I did, for example, at the university, we founded the Purple Parents Society, we call them.
Okay.
Purple is the color of the university, right? And we asked the parents to provide the rowers with food during the regatta.
Okay.
So we brought the tent, the parents brought all the food, and it was such a wonderful experience to get the parents in a positive thing. They wouldn't say, "Oh, my son needs to be in the first boat," or whatever. Not at all, right? They were excited to see a team in action, and they were so excited to see when the rowers and then also alumni came by. They learned to get to know the alumni. So there were situations where I felt really, really satisfied and happy that I could help provide an environment that brings a community together, right? And then, of course, coaching conferences, it's something too, when you meet with, especially with young coaches, really excited young coaches who want to learn, who want to share their own experiences. And so these are moments where I felt really that the work that I put in finds some resonance and gets appreciated. And this is a wonderful experience.
Excellent. And probably no one more knowledgeable about this than yourself. I mean, you've certainly been through quite a bit as far as experience, as far as education, as far as it sounds like mentoring younger coaches as well. Want to be respectful of your time. We have had a great conversation here, but if you are a coach or a trainer or an athlete interested in the sport at all, definitely pick up your copy of Rowing Science. If, like I said, if you're an athlete, you can definitely get an edge by taking in a lot of the content in this book. You can find it on our website, us.humankinetics.com. I know it's on Amazon. You can probably find it in numerous bookstores around as well. Thank you so much for your time. I could probably talk to you all day and listen to stories about rowing and your different experiences. But I wanted to give you a chance here to kind of wrap it up, to let everyone know how they can, keep up with all the great work that you're doing. I don't know if you're available, if people want to reach out and have extra questions for you.
So first of all, thanks for having me on your program. I'm obviously following a little bit over the years your work there. I think it's fantastic. I love when sport topics are getting presented and show the different aspects of sport. And I mean, I hope that initiatives like mine with the book encourage people to stay healthy, enjoy sport, doing it the proper way, and trying to learn some new things. This would be, for me, fantastic feedback. I'm happy to answer questions, and I mean, I get quite frequently coaches sending me some questions. I would at first think you should have a look in the book. I have to tell you one last little story in terms of the book. I was invited to a training camp in the US about 2 months ago. And, they did organize a little question and answer evening get together with some during having some little pieces to eat. And so the coaches and athletes, they asked questions, and this was just about a week after the book came out. So I had literally one of the first physical copies in my hand. And so the first question comes, and I said, well, look at page 120. There's the answer. The next question came, and I said, well, I mean, I can explain now, but if you want to go in detail, look at page 174. It was really funny that it turned out that literally all the questions this evening that came up were actually somewhere in this book, which again made me so proud that to see that actually the book is a nice compilation of all areas in our sport.
Right. Definitely. Yeah, there is, everyone listening, seriously, pick up your copy of the book. We talked about a lot of things in the book, but you're going to learn so much more. I mean, we barely touched on a lot of the information that's in the book, so you're definitely going to find benefit from that. So again, thank you so much for your time. I really do appreciate it, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.
Thank you, Aaron. Have a great day too. Bye-bye.
Thank you. You as well.